Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Communication Talk, episode 13. Today, we're going to talk about representation and interaction in video games. Let me introduce our guests. So we have James Ivory from the US. We have Nelson Zagalo from Portugal. We have Abonti Mehtaz from Bangladesh. Welcome you all, and thank you for joining us here today. I'm really excited to talk about our topic on video games. I will, if I may, let me ask you all, how are you all doing in this situation? James, how are you?
I'm very good. Thank you for asking, and thank you for letting me join you all today.
Yeah, thank you. How are you, Nelson?
Everything okay. Thank you for inviting me also, and everything is nice here. Oh, the COVID situation is strong, but we are keeping.
Yeah, we all are trying to survive. How are you, Abonti?
Oh, hi. Nice meeting you, Awny. I'm fine, thank you. So life is a little bit puzzled in this COVID situation, as you know, like others, but we are trying to do better. Thank you.
So the classes are going online.
Yeah, everything is going online. I'm doing another study in Europe, in Spain. So I'm also doing that online. Yeah, everything is going online.
Okay. All right. So let me start with James. So when we see video games as for representation, if you start with that, do you see like any differences as for race or gender? The representation in video games, is it different than what we see in films and TV shows, or more or less similar?
So we've done a little bit of research on this, and then of course others have as well. When it comes to, I'm primarily, unfortunately, mostly speaking about media, video games, movies that we see released in the United States, because a lot of what we've studied is the United States market. Of course, the United States is a big exporter of media, including movies and video games. So when we talk about representations in U.S. media, they're often the same media that are being widely consumed all over the world. But historically, when we look at movies and television, white people tend to be statistically overrepresented in movies, television, and other American broadcast media, electronic media, film. And then over the years, in the last few decades, since especially since about the 1970s, we've seen some improvements in that area in terms of representation of some non-white minorities. We've seen some improvements in at least just the sheer number of characters that are Black. But we have not seen much improvement in terms of representation of other non-white minorities. So mostly we continue to see in film, television, white people are overrepresented. The numbers of representation of Black people has improved slightly. With other non-white minorities, it has not improved much. And then, of course, the other problem is that's just the numbers, what we call head counts. When it comes to the nature of those portrayals, there are a lot of other problems where white people tend to be portrayed more favorably. They're more likely to be portrayed in a favorable way than non-white people. Now, when it comes to video games, the situation is very similar. So I was part of a study that was led by a guy at the University of Southern California now called Dimitri Williams, where we looked at thousands and thousands of video game characters. It's been a few years now, but what we found was that white people were, again, overly represented. So statistically, there were more white people in video games than there are in the United States population. Excuse me, buddy. And sorry about that. I'm gonna need you to sit down, buddy. Sorry. White people in video games are overrepresented compared to the population in the United States. And these were based on video games that are popular in the United States, but because the video game market's global, it's going to be very similar to video games popular elsewhere in the world. And then basically every other race, the way we categorize them, and categorizing race for video game characters can be difficult because you can't usually ask them, of course. But based on the way we saw race categorized, every race, every ethnic group except for white people was statistically underrepresented, except for in some cases Asians and Pacific Islanders were not underrepresented, and that might be partly because of some of the game producing countries that produce a lot, that export a lot of video games, include Japan and South Korea. But for the most part, as with other media, we see white people heavily overrepresented, and even more overrepresented when it comes to main characters, playable characters. So for the most part, we see a statistical overrepresentation of white people in video game characters, and especially in important video game characters.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. I feel like in movies, there has been a slight change. Like we see more other races as well, but video games is still kind of stuck there with more white. So just a quick follow-up question. As for gender, like how do you see like how women characters are more sexualized? Is it more severe in video games than other like say advertisements or other forms?
So again, I want to make sure I'm not doing all the talking. I'm sure others have some good ideas, but from some of those same studies and some studies I did before and studies by others, I think personally I would find it difficult to compare like it's all more or less sexualized, because we have a lot of problems with sexualization of women in media in general. So I'm not sure I can say with any confidence whether necessarily female characters are more sexualized in games than a lot of other media. But I can say that they tend to be very sexualized, and of course the studies we've done have found that female characters are more likely to be sexualized than male characters, and a large number of them are. This is combined with another problem where not only are there fewer female characters are underrepresented in games, and they're more likely to be sexualized, but they're also more likely to be unimportant characters that aren't a key part of the story, characters that aren't involved in active decisions. So they're portrayed they're disproportionately portrayed as sexualized and also as passive. And I think this is problematic when you consider that depending on how you define video games, there's not much of a gender gap in video game play. There's as many women as men play video games anymore, or very close to it. But the portrayal of women is very far behind. There are fewer of them. They're less likely to be important in games, and they're more likely to be sexualized, and all of those things. It's a concern of what that may teach boys and girls who play video games.
Thank you. Moving forward to Nielsen, how is first I just wanted to ask you about video game studies in Portugal. Do you do comparative studies, or what is it like?
We do. I normally divide the studies that we do here in three different fronts: the people that are working more in development, the people working more in design, and the people working more in studies criticism of video games. At the moment, we have a large community working in the development, but these guys are more from the computer science departments. And then we have the design and the criticism that is divided between communication, humanists, and then design and arts people. In terms of the specific subjects that are being studied, there's a lot of discussion about comparisons with other media, like in every other country. But there's also a lot of interest in finding out the way that games are being created, and the way that they manage to challenge the relation between the spectator or the watchers or the players and the content that is being delivered to them. And so the question is really to understand if there's really a change happening in terms of discourse, in terms of the way you produce the content, you produce a story or a message or of values. Is it really different or not? are you giving any kind of power to the people on the other side, the receptors, or are they just witnessing like when watching a movie or reading a book? So these are the questions that we are very interested in here, and but it's very diverse. Okay, it's a lot of people working very different points and perspectives.
Oh, yeah, coming to that. So when we compare digital storytelling across different forms, different content, where does video game lies as for evoking emotions among the gamers? Like, is it more similar to films or and other content? Or I mean, is it also a very strong content that elicit emotions like other content like films and TV shows?
Yeah, yeah. This is one of the things that I've been studying for the past 10 years, 15 years, and in the beginning, the games were more related with a very specific types of emotions, more related with creation of tension, creation of euphoric emotions and frustration emotions. But with this with these last 10 years, with the more involvement of storytelling inside video games, they have managed to enlarge the kinds of emotional experience they can create in the receivers, in the audiences. So at this point, you have now games that are able to elicit all the range of emotions like film and like literature. There's nothing that make them very different. Of course, in terms of spikes of tension and frustration and even euphorics, they managed to be able to push it a little bit more than a movie. But this is the same like comparing to a theme park. When you go to a theme park, you have all these sliders and all these they are creating stories in the mind of the people, but they are not really managing to elicit the emotions through the stories. The stories are only part of the entire experience. So the way you manage to elicit these kinds of emotions is through certain kinds of tricks that we play with the cognitive system of the people. And when we manage to convince them they are losing, they are winning, they are not being able, they need to repeat till they can overcome the challenge. So there are something that make them different. But when you go to digital storytelling and when you use the storytelling system as you use it in movies and literature, is not very different. Okay, you don't. In the end, if you discuss here about transmedia storytelling going from a range of different media, we can manage to create an overall experience through the different media without very great differences in terms of emotional elicitation. Okay, the question is always in the way you manage to use the best as possible the different kind of media to illustrate the ideas and the values that you want to illustrate, because literature is good for something and film is good for different things, and video games are good for other different things.
In that study, what is the play of interactivity when we are studying emotions for video games? Because some video games are really interactive, some are less. So where does the interactivity play the role here?
Well, the question is that when we are doing these studies, normally when we are studying the video games, we define that we are only counting the moments of interactivity. Why? Because in the moments of no interaction is like watching a movie. Okay, is the cutscenes, they are using the exact same grammar and same language of films. And so when we want to challenge the difference between the two media, we need really to look for the interactive parts. And the interactive parts, we have a lot of different problems, because at the moment the great industry tries to put all the cards on the shooting, on the violence, and the most easiest things, because the shooting is very easy to have a strong feedback. Okay, you shoot and you see the feedback is immediately. When you are picking stuff from the ground, when you are touching things, you need to invest time to decodify, to comprehend what's happening, and so it takes more time in terms of interaction. And so people tend to prefer these kinds of interactions, and the industry knows that. So the industry tries, if you look, for example, a more standard game like Tomb Raider that is well known wide in the wide world, you have all the story and exposition of storytelling be done through the sequences of video or movie scenes, and then all the sequences of little puzzles and shootings and hidings and all that in the interactive parts. So they fail in using the interaction to really produce significance or meaning inside the story. Okay, this is not an easy thing to do, because people are used to a certain canon of mechanics, and so people like that. And also there's another question that I've been asking myself through the last years. Well, at some point when we are looking at video games, should we really ask them that they need to be 100% interactive? Or if a video game is not 100% interactive, is only 50%, can we really accept this as still a video game, or is part film, part video game? But this is a question that we can discuss. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. Going to Abonti, Mehtaz, how video gaming culture is influencing our mainstream culture in Bangladesh?
Not in Bangladesh, as far as I understand, like video game is actually impacting our culture in many ways. First of all, I want to mention about like our intercultural communication. If we just focus on that, there are both positive and negative sides. Like video game is a kind of field actually that provides everybody an opportunity to mix together from different parts of the world. That was little bit impossible without digital media or without like video game. Especially one thing like now Microsoft and other organization, as we know, like they have introduced systems that helps even the little bit disabled pupils or like who cannot mobilize so fast, they can also communicate with others. So on our culture there are different kinds of effects, both positive and negative. Positive in this sense, like we are as far as I understand, from my opinion, we are gaining more communication skills, how to interact with other cultures people, because when people are busy in a game, there are a lot of video games where even 32 persons the pupils can play together from different parts of the world. So here is a good kind of mixing, like we are learning how to develop our skills of communicating from other cultures people, and also we are becoming more and more tolerant, that is called like cultural sensitivity. We are developing that because we are just becoming to know about different customs, different traditions, even different religions. This is the best opportunity, one of the best opportunity that actually just is a kind of collaboration we can do through this. And another positive side is that I think culture is the, as we know, culture is the combination of like our values, beliefs, language, and everything. So our language skill is also improving because of this, because you know, like we say for example, like English is our second language, but for video games we can even improve the skills of our English language or other countries language, because here pupils play from different parts. So another thing is like that both culture, or every culture has some sort of positive and negative sides. So we shouldn't like become too much ethnocentric. So there is a that usually we do, but thing is that it's a common playground where we come to know about both the positive sides of other cultures. So, but there are also some negative sides as well, like there are some rules and traditions and customs in every culture, but video games sometimes it can create like cultural imperialism that is very common even in television or film and this kind of things. So it can happen like different negative things can even enter into our culture. But as far as I understand, positive sides actually overweight the negative side. So it's better. Like we are moving to a global culture. That is the main thing, and we are knowing each other very in a very well organized way, because intercultural communication is a thing that is very very important throughout our whole life. That I understand. Thank you.
Thank you. So as you were talking about language skills as well, so do you see that video games also affecting how we communicate then?
Obviously it affects on our communication skills in many ways. Say for example, like it is actually developing both our verbal and non-verbal skills, both verbal communication and non-verbal communication. Because for verbal communication we are interacting with people from other countries whose language is different from us. And for non-verbal communication, like when we play video games or pupils play video games, we need to use some sort of expressions like moving our hands, moving our face, and this kind of thing. So this is also an expression of non-verbal communication that is also developing. And also like reasoning capability, our capability of reasoning, our capability of analyzing is improving. Say for instance, like if I say for instance Overwatch or like Battlefield 4, yeah, these two video games, they actually helps to develop or enhance our reasoning capability. So this is one thing. Another thing is that in communication, there is a term that is in communication that people that is, you may pronounce it in different ways, like geek or geek, whatever it is. It was like a people, there are some people who had knowledge, better knowledge about ICT, but they were a little bit excluded from the mainstream culture. I mean, they were just not that much friendly, or they didn't have too much friends or something like that. But now for this kind of video game and this kind of opportunities, they can easily interact with people from any parts of the world. Even you don't need to get out of your home, right? So you can just have a computer or mobile and you can just play video games and like that. So they are also developing their own culture that is called like gaming culture, that we know about the term like gaming culture. So is that they're not even feel like they're excluded from everyone or mainstream culture. Now they are developing their own cultures, and the gamers consider themselves own individuals or own members of their culture. So in many ways it is actually developing our communication skills. And another term I want to mention, that is a term that's Games for Change, that was developed in 2004, and it's a kind of organization. They actually provide information and like necessary information for social changes. They provide that information to different peoples and organizations who wants to contribute for social changes, say for instance. So it's like they can just perform better in social changes, or they can contribute in social changes through that kind of games as well. So I think it's like a huge impact. Like another impact is like for communication. We know that for communication, goal is a very important thing, and teamwork is a very important thing, right? So like teamwork and goal is a very important and or significant component in video game. In video games, when different players play together, sometimes they have a common goal that they need to achieve, that or they need to defeat their enemy or something like that. So it also teaches us how to do teamwork, and teamwork is very significant thing for communication. So yes, it is helping in communication or contributing in communication in many ways. Thank you.
Thank you. Going back to James, so video games have some unique experiences that the users or gamers have. So based on the unique experiences of digital video games, how does it affect social interaction of the users?
Yeah, so that's a good question, right? That I don't know if we know all the ways yet that games are influencing social interaction, but I think a lot of the academics who study video games, at least a lot of the academics I've been around, and especially people who are studying it from kind of the social and behavioral science perspective, which is sort of the perspective I'm familiar with as a researcher, I think is very far behind that question. I think historically we've spent a lot of time looking at what video games do to people. So like, what does it do to you to play a violent video game? What does it do to you to have this or that message in a video game? And I think a lot of the a lot of the social science researchers are still kind of thinking that way often. And what we are probably need to be asking a lot more is what are the good and bad things? What are the problems? What are the concerns? What are the dynamics of people's social interactions with each other in video games? So I think my first response to that is I think that behavioral researchers, social scientists haven't spent enough time on the questions that you're asking. There, I think too often we're still focused on sort of just, how does certain kinds of content affect the player, and not enough about how do players interact with each other. Because I think increasingly, of course, the most popular video games deal with primarily players' experiences with one each other, whether it's, trying to shoot at each other with virtual guns or trying to work together to solve a problem, and the kinds of sort of friendships and rivalries and frustrations and everything else that emerge with these people dealing with each other. And I think a disproportionate amount of the research is still focused on sort of what do games do to people instead of how do people interact with each other in games. So my first answer to your question, I think it hasn't been studied enough, especially if we look at what games are like now. We're still asking questions like, what does it mean that you're pretending to be a soldier, instead of what does it mean that you're talking to these people all over the world and things like that. And I think that social interaction is where some of the biggest questions are, some of the biggest promises. Abonti mentioned some things about like the way people interact to solve problems. I think also some of the biggest concerns, players abusing each other, toxic behavior, people being exposed to points of view that might be dangerous or harmful or irresponsible. I think those are the questions that aren't studied enough. I think we're beginning to do a better job to look at that in social science, and I think that so far we're seeing a lot of cause for concern. That including some of the research we've done, it's a minority of the behavior, but it appears that a lot of online behavior involves things that people don't necessarily encounter as much in real life as they do online, like verbal abuse, racial slurs, gender-based slurs, that this sort of behavior can be common in games. I'm not saying a majority, but enough that it's a concern. And then, of course, we're, I think, only beginning to kind of understand the way people get exposed to, you talked about things like learning language, all kinds of things through games. So I think we've only kind of just begun to sort of unpack the promise and then the troubles associated with all that online interaction. My main concern would be that it's understudied. I think right now, a lot of our institutions and laboratories and researchers have habits of studying games as like a stimulus that affects people instead of studying how people interact. And I think there's a methodological issue there that I think it's easier to sit somebody down in front of a game and an experiment and see what it does, with one kind of controller or one kind of content than it is to, I think it's harder to study I think it's harder to study complex social interactions than it is to just study these sort of stimulus effects. So we are, I think personally, behavioral researchers as a group are very far behind on studying the social interactions in games. And I think that we need to do better.
Are you also interested in looking at maybe if they have behavior change in also like real life, I mean, in person, as like as for like how they interact during the video games, maybe with other players as well?
And I think I go back and forth on some of these questions, because sometimes I think there might be something really unique about the way players interact in video games. And I think sometimes the more I think about it, a lot of what I see in video games is probably that some of the most interesting social dimensions of video games aren't really anything unique about video games at all. They're just another place where people interact with each other, if that makes sense. And that can be good in that we're just seeing another arena where people can interact with one another. But it can be troubling because I think some of the same problems that we see elsewhere exist in the same ways in video games. One example that we've studied some is things like gender bias or subconscious ways that people treat, for example, women different than men, even when they're very nice people. We see that some of those things still persist in video games, even though you're in sort of this, you might be in a fantasy world where you're pretending to be an elf or a troll or a World War II soldier, and we still see some of the same assumptions about women and men and things like that. So in some ways, games might be sort of a big opportunity for change. We heard a mention of that Games for Change organization. And then in some ways, a lot of what at least we've found so far sometimes is that games are just a place where people interact with much the same good and bad interactions that we have in other online spaces.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So we have we saw a lot of like you were saying, like we are more focused, or maybe that's part of the reason of the methodological part, that we study a lot about the effects and the stimulus on the users. So like we see a lot of studies of the effects of violence in video games. So where do you see like the trends of the effect studies of video games going, and maybe what are the challenges, or where should we head to?
I think that's another real good question. I think we're slowly beginning to work more and more toward studying again, I think, like social interactions in games and the experiences that people derive from games, rather than just sort of the effects of a very specific type of game stimuli. I think they're also, we're doing better with methodological issues. I think in the last several years, but especially in the last few years, we're seeing a lot more attention to the idea that a lot of social and behavioral research might be very selective in what it reports. And when we talk about things like effects of game violence, basically a lot of different social effects of games, it could be that research has been kind of selective in reporting and may present an inflated view of some of those effects. And I think we're moving into a period where we're being a lot more introspective about how we report research. And I think we're finding that maybe some of the big claims about game effects that we used to see, like that video game violence will make you a criminal, or that there are these really strong, consistent effects of certain kind of content. I think we're realizing that some of those really broad effects probably aren't as strong as the published literature suggests, because the published literature has been very selective. And I think now we're really facing a challenge of how to look at much more subtle effects. And again, I think the answer in that is looking a lot more at what players derive from games, why they play games, what they draw from them, and especially how they interact with each other. And there's cause for concern. I think about a researcher who I respect a lot at Ohio State called Jessie Fox. She studies things like the way people bully and harass each other in games. And I think that's much more important to me if someone's getting harassed or bullied than things like if they're, pretending to shoot aliens. And I think we're starting to get into a lot more of those questions. And I think, again, sort of, we're seeing people accomplish sort of great things with games, people learning language, people forming communities, people being inspired to take on social problems. And I think we know very little about how that works. So I think those are the directions we need to go, is sort of what do people do with each other in games. And I think we're going that way. And I think it's a lot of the younger and more innovative researchers that are doing that.
Thank you. I think, I don't know if we lost our other guests, but I think, I think they're trying to join.
I'm seeing you. I'm seeing only James.
Okay, you guys are still there. Okay,
Yeah.
good to know, because I thought I lost you.
Yeah, we are here. No, we are here. We can see you now.
Okay.
Now we can see you. And now here are the four.
Now we can see everybody. Yeah.
All right. Okay. I literally thought that I lost you guys. So I was I was worried. Okay, good to know you are still there. So I would go to Nelson. So I wanted to talk quickly about video game literacy. So what do you think about the emphasis on video game literacy from communication perspective? Does video game literacy take account into the film literacy? How does that maybe impacting or influencing video game literacy? Or are we really I think you mentioned about studying video games from computational perspective, or from computer software engineering that way. So how much do you think, like, from communication perspective, we are building video game literacy?
Well, I believe that, well, the question with the literacy is being built by the culture, the people building the games and the people playing the games. And the literacy is something that is being built throughout the creation of the culture and the art and the design. The way we can look at it, there's a lot of research being done in terms of video games, in terms of trying to understand the kind of impacts video games can have in people, and the kind of we can call them learning effects, or we can call them behavior change, like game for change that has been mentioned previously. But the question in terms of the way we can approach it from the side of the communication, but from the side of people using them in the learning communities, I believe there are some things that are very particular from video games and can be used for the teaching and the learning processes. Because the interactivity is something different in terms of the conceptualization of the content, in terms of the way you create the content and you understand the content, that if you put kids to learn how to build a video game, they will have to learn certain kinds of competence that are not present when you are learning to create a film, or when you are trying to write a composition or write a story. It's not only a question of having to learn to code, because this is another great discussion that people in the technology side wants to push. It's a kind of an agenda for pushing the coding, with which I can agree. But for me, the most important thing with the interactivity inside the literacy domain is that for a kid, he needs to understand the problem that you are trying to build inside the game. You need to understand in from the perspective of the other person that is playing the game. So when you are building the game, when you are designing it, when you are making some drawings or designing it in some kind of software, you cannot only just put your side or your idea of how the reality works. You need to build the reality inside the games from the perspective of the users, of the players, okay? And the good thing when we are building games is that you never put a game outside before testing the game, okay? This is not like an artistic world where this is my artwork and you need to accept it as it is. No, this is a design piece, and so we need to test it. And the test is a very important phase. It's a phase where you will see how people play your game. And then you start understanding that people really don't understand the game in the same manner that you designed it. People live in different worlds. They have different experience of the world. They have played different games. They have read different books. And so you need to watch it. You need to observe. You need to really take a lot of notes and then bring back the game and redesign the game. Okay. And so this is a way of learning that will help you a lot in your path to literacy inside of games, but it's something that we can export into other areas, okay? Because this is what we call inside the interaction design. It's what we call user-based or user-centered. So we are not building things for us to be consumed by us, but we are building things for the users. But more important than that, because when you are shooting a film or when you are writing a book, you know that you have an audience and you think about them. But here it goes further. Why? Because when in the moment we are creating it, we are bringing people inside and asking them, hey, look, we have the game here, please play it and let me look at you playing it. Okay? And we'll analyze people, we'll interview them, we'll discuss with them, and we will change according. So the user is present through the entire production pipeline in terms of the design of the interaction. And this is very important for the literacy system, because in terms of competencies, it really makes you aware of the way you communicate an idea, okay? Because your idea, you can have a very brilliant idea, but you need to express it in some manner that the other people will understand it. And we learn to tweak our writings, our shootings in different manners for a target audience, like from 8 to 12, for a target audience from 50 to 80. But in games, in game design, in interaction design is not the same, because the interactivity is not something that you can just put it there and hope that people learn how to interact with it. You need to design it with the other users together. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Right. As for the nature of the video games, it's very interactive and there's technology. So do you think like researchers are heavily interested in doing social scientific research, the effects studies, and this kind of research? And are we lacking some critical cultural research of video in this video games research? Are we focusing enough from that perspective as well?
Yeah, what James was talking about is something that I believe is lacking. The question about how do people really interact in the sphere outside the game. Okay, the game interferes, and this is more present in social games and then massive online games. And this is something that I've been looking through in terms of the design of engagement and experience, but this is something that is still missing. I'm still using a lot of theory and studies from the 60s, 70s in the cognitive sciences, but we need to update them now inside the game field, and this is very complicated, as James was talking about, because it's much more easier to put someone to play and ask them some questions. But then to look at the way they interact, I have some students now, for example, doing research in terms of how little kids from 10 to 12 years age, how they manage to learn English through games. And so the manner to do this is not only through the interaction between the kid and the game. The good manner to do this is analyzing the teams of children in schools, and the way they talk about the game, and the way they use the discussion between themselves to improve inside the game. And so the game is pushing a lot of discussions and interactions between people that, okay, it was already happening with television and film, because people would come out from movie science theater and were discussing about the movie. But in terms of the interactive game, you don't come out, it's not finished. It's something that you come out, and then you need to speak with your colleague, with your partner. Well, how do we will work in the next session to improve our experience, or how we'll manage to work together to surpass this challenge or that challenge. And so there's a lot of things happening in this sphere around games. It's beyond what we call in video games the magic circle. The magic circle is the safe area inside the game that's not transpiring through reality. But these social games and massive online games, they transpire to reality, and they put people to discuss and interact with each other. And here, there's where a lot of the research is missing, and it takes a lot of work, but we need to invest in that.
Thank you. Abonti, are you still there?
I'm here and I can hear you as well. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I wanted to go back to you with a follow-up question. You were talking about a lot of opportunities of video games that video games offer, like creating global culture. Even you talked about maybe platforms like Microsoft. They're bringing video games that maybe disabled people can also play. So making bringing more opportunities for people who couldn't probably even communicate with others other ways. So all sounds so great. However, when we're talking about video games and heavy video game playing, we need some gadgets. We need technologies. So there comes the question of affordability. So because thinking about, say, Bangladesh, you need good internet connection. You need those either PCs, those gadgets. So does it also create inequality? Can like maybe only students in the cities, in the capital, people in the cities, and people who can afford it and who come from that kind of family, who go to the good schools, are actually enjoying these opportunities. So what do you think about like the rest of the country?
Oh, well, the situation is a little bit same like other social media use. For instance, like if you think about, or if we think about internet users, that is also, there is pretty much inequality, because now when we are taking even classes or in through like Zoom or other social media, a lot of our students in different educational institutions cannot join because they don't have the access, even in the rural areas or outside the city, Dhaka. So there are network problems and lower internet connection, something like that. So obviously there is an inequality even in the use of the video games. And because only solvent pupils or who are little bit can provide these provide money for that or for use video games, they can just use that. This is a problem. Another problem is, I think, like the society structure. This is another thing, because like different society acts in different ways, people thinks in different ways. Because say for instance, I know some parents or guardians of the children or child who may not be willing to let their children to play video games or something like that. So it may not be a problem in a like in another country, in another part of the world. Even there are some sort of like they are just taking care of their children, which games they are playing and what games they are not. So there is also lack of freedom here, I think. This is sometimes good and sometimes bad. And regarding your question, yes, obviously there is an inequality. And as far as we know, we are a developing country, and it's not possible to change the situation overnight. So we just can try, even from the government level or like from other pupils, for civic society or other pupils, like how can we make internet little bit available for everyone, or maybe lower price, something like that, so that we can ensure these positive sides of video games, and pupils, even students can use video games, and then they can participate in video games and can learn a lot of things. As we know, throughout the whole world right now, video game is even using for educational purpose. There are a lot of better kind of video games that actually help students to interact more, that they cannot do in traditional classrooms, that giving feedbacks and taking things properly, interacting with each other. Even this kind of using video games for educational purposes, sometimes it increases the capability of the students, their creativity, increases their creativity. So I think we need to ensure all that, but it's not possible in a night or one night. But we can try. At least we should try. Thank you.
Thank you. Um, do you also see, like in Bangladesh, that video games affecting other forms of media?
Yeah, definitely video game is affecting other forms of media. Here I want to mention about the other parts of the world as well, because like in Bangladesh, different medias come little bit later even than other countries. So I want to mention about other parts. Say for example, if we think about television programs, so how it is influenced by video games. Sometimes we see there are some kinds of video games that television program producers were highly influenced by those programs, and they just made their programs on the following the style of certain kind of video games. even sometimes video games turn to a TV series. We also saw that. Like, say for instance, I want to say the program like it's a program that is called like The Guild. It was a TV series, and it was turned into, it was following the, its structure was following the structure of the video games, and the story content was a little bit more focusing on the video game story or style. So definitely it is changing the television programs. And even regarding the films, if we see, there are a lot of films that are actually in box office, their hit and their profit was too much, like mentionable, and they also followed the structure of video games sometimes. They also followed the story or content of the video game sometimes. And another thing I want to mention, another term that is called machinia. That machinia terms, that is a kind of thing when we make like films or something like that. Just what we do in that, we just recorded the movement of the characters in the video game, and we make a kind of animation films or movies kind of thing. So obviously this is also a new phenomenon. Like, film is changing in a way how it was developed or how it was structured or organized. The production process is also changing. Even if we think about the music, for instance, like music is also changing for video games, because when video game was first initiated, it was just limited in some sort of musics like beep of computer or like title songs or something like that. But now we can see there are a lot of changes. Like, even a lot of recognized band groups or like musical groups or musicians, they are even willing more to use their songs or their musics or their rhythms in video games, or only sometimes they only perform for video games. So the situation is changing, even from the music industry, like television industry, film industry. They are even following some trends of video games, and they're adopting some structures and like contents from the video games, because people have realized, like, people have already realized that they cannot ignore video games. I mean, the mainstream media, they cannot completely ignore the video game. So as video game is becoming more and more popular, not only to the adolescents or not only to the children, even to the elders or others, so we cannot deny it. So we'll have to adjust with the new communication technology or new media, because it's a kind of new media. So mainstream media is trying to adapt it, that some sort of structure of new media. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Abonti. Before we end, I kind of have an opinion question for all. You all can please feel free to share what you think. So what do you see the video game industry is trending during the COVID pandemic? Now, of course, it's different. And will gaming keep growing when it ends? We are over the pandemic. How would it change the trend, and where we would go? Anyone? Maybe Nelson, you wanna hop on?
It's very well in terms of futurology. Is always very complicated to do any kind of assertion and try to understand what will be the future. But at the moment, one of the trends I've seen in the when the pandemic started in March, previous years, March, April, I saw a really great trend around the games online, the free games online, like Fortnite, where all the kids were going online in these games to build what we were talking previously, to build the social interaction they had in schools, in the playgrounds. They didn't manage to have these playgrounds through video conference. Video conference was not good enough. Messaging was not good enough. But going into Fortnite and games like Fortnite, where they were playing, they had all these emotions, frustrations, rhythms, and the joys and all this. They were feeling like they were still at the school, at the recess, playing, laughing, being together. And so this was one of the trends that I really liked in the first part of the pandemics. And probably now that we are closing everything, shutting everything here in Portugal, probably we're going through this again. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. What do you think, James, about the trends of video games during this COVID?
So I haven't seen any. This is probably something I should know more about, but I haven't seen a lot of data about use. But I see a lot of anecdotal things that, because of the amount of time people are having at home, that there's people using video games more. I think especially, I think the kind of games Nelson's referring to that are sort of virtual spaces to interact with each other. One problem we have with academia is video games can mean a lot of things, and I think a lot of times academics, present company excluded, will treat video games like they're all one thing when it could mean a lot of different things. But virtual spaces, people having more time and more desire to interact with each other. I think that's also not just limited to children. For example, personally, I've seen the phenomenon of a lot more of my friends that I haven't talked to in ages using things like Facebook chats and video chatting apps, that people who had never ever reached out to me on those because of the pandemic. And I would imagine we're seeing the same thing in games, of using them as a different space. I'm not sure what that means for the industry. I think when the pandemic is over, we may see a slight decline in video game use because people are so excited to do something else. But I think one thing we've learned, maybe not so much because of video games only, but remote learning, more heavy media use in general online, including video games, is that in a lot of places where we had what we thought was a pretty sufficient broadband infrastructure has been heavily strained. I know in my own home, we're lucky to have very good internet access, and the internet backbone is pretty strained with all the children at school and everything at once. So it may be interesting to see when we get out of this pandemic, how we react to that, if we see, redoubled efforts to build that infrastructure or less so. I think, even though you asked about industry, I think another step back to how researchers and academics study things, I wonder if this is a chance for us to be a little less alarmist about games and screen time. A big trend, aside from just whether video games are terrible for you, which is much too complicated of a question for a simple answer. And then also, I think we've seen a lot of interest in whether just screen time is associated with all these horrible outcomes among children, everything from mental health problems to suicide. And I think the pandemic has hopefully given academics a chance to remember that there are a lot worse things going on than whether or not somebody spends a few hours more or less on their screens. So hopefully it's a chance for individuals, families, the industry, but also academics to take a broader look at some of these things in the broader context of, there are much bigger things going on than another half hour here and there on video games. So I'm a little afraid to speculate on what the industry will do. I'm sure they're way ahead of anything I know, but anecdotally, it seems like people are using games a lot more. But after the pandemic, I'm suspicious people might redouble their interest in other things, and games might have to work harder to keep our attention.
Thank you. And the last but not the least, Abonti, do you think gaming is booming during the pandemic?
Actually, there are two sides. Like from the game developers' perspective, I was reading an article before 2 or 3 days. Some game developers claimed, they are claiming, they are facing little bit delay in kind of programming their games or making their games because of this COVID-19. I mean, there is lack of face-to-face workplace or working condition. So it's a remote working condition. So in some cases they claim that the game that was about to finish making making it producing it 2 months earlier, it has become delayed. But if we want to think about the use of the video games, I think from my opinion, as far as I have seen from my known pupils or from my own circles, they are viewing more and more in this pandemic situation, because pandemic situation they don't have people don't have much options for entertainment or from learning. Even I do agree with Professor Jagalo and then Professor Ivory, like for even educational purpose it has a great impact. And also we are we are spending more times on internet, especially children or like adolescents who don't go to offices or other places, so they are confined in the home, because even schools are going through online or remote learning, so they're just more time they're spending on computer. So whenever they spend more time on computer, obviously they go for like video games and other options, something like that. Now the question is how we are going to use it. we are going to use that time like positively or negatively. That is the question. Like if we use this for positive purpose, that is perfect, like for educational purpose or learning something, that is perfect, because it's a kind of communication also, like video game, like television or other media. It's a kind of media, I agree. So but if it happens like, even say for instance children, they just don't go for their studies and all time they're just on the computer or laptops or for video games, this is also like bad for their health and their even mental stress or condition, something like that. So if we can use this use of video games in a productive way and can grasp something positive from this, even in the pandemic situation, that would be better, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank you all for sharing these moments with us. And it has been my pleasure to meet you all, chat with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice meeting you, everyone. Yeah.
Nice to meet you, and thank you, Mumtahin, for your great moderation.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for your moderation. Yeah. It was great. The session was great. Yeah.
Thank
Excellent
you.
work. Thank you. And thank you to the organizers.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good night or have a good day, depending on where you are.
Okay. See you.
Yeah. All of you too. Yeah.